Welcome to English Mirror. A literary movement is a general term for pieces of literature by different authors who share a similar impetus for writing in some way. Today, let's go through six major literary movements. Confessional poetry. Confessional poetry or confessionalism is a style of poetry that emerged in the United States during the late 1950s and early 1960s. An autobiographical mode of verse that reveals the poet's personal problems with unusual frankness. In 1959, M. L. Rosenthal first used the term confessional in a review of Robert Lowell's life studies entitled Poetry as Confession. It is sometimes also classified as a form of postmodernism. The term is usually applied to certain poets of the United States from the late 1950s to the late 1960s, notably Robert Lowell, whose life studies published in 1959 and For the Union Debt published in 1964 deal with his divorce and mental breakdowns. Lowell's canter had been encouraged in part by that of the gay poet Allen Ginsberg in Howl, published in 1956, and by the intensely personal poetry of Theodore Rothey. Other important examples of confessional poetry are Anne Sexton's To Bedlam and Part Way Back, published in 1960, and All My Pretty Ones, published in 1962, including poems on abortion and life in mental hospitals. John Berryman's Dream Songs, published in 1964, on alcoholism and insanity. Sylvia Plath's poems on suicide in Ariel, published in 1965, and W. D. Snodgrass' Heart's Needle, published in 1969, on his divorce. The term is sometimes used more loosely to refer to any personal or autobiographical poetry, but its distinctive sense depends on the candid examination of what were at the time of writing virtually unmentionable kinds of private distress. The genuine strengths of confessional poets combined with the pity evoked by their high suicide rate. Berryman, Sexton, and Plath all killed themselves, encouraged in the reading public a romantic confusion between poetic excellence and inner torment. Beat Generation. The Beat Generation was a literary movement started by a group of authors whose work explored and influenced American culture and politics in the post war era. The bulk of their work was published and popularized throughout the 1950s. The central elements of beat culture are the rejection of standard narrative values, making a spiritual quest, the exploration of American and Eastern religions, the rejection of materialism, explicit portrayals of the human condition, experimentation with psychedelic drugs, and sexual liberation and exploration. Allen Ginsberg's Howl, published in 1956, William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch, published in 1959, and Jack Kerouac's On the Road, published in 1957, are among the best known examples of beat literature. Both Howl and Naked Lunch were the focus of obscenity trials that ultimately helped to liberalize publishing in the United States. The members of the Beat generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity. Jack Kerouac introduced the phrase Beat generation in 1948 to characterize a perceived underground anti-conformist youth movement in New York. The female contemporaries of Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs were intimately involved in the creation of beat philosophy and literature, and yet remain markedly absent from the mainstream interpretation of the most important aspects and figures of the movement. Beat Generation women who have been published include Eddie Parker, Joyce Johnson, Carolyn Cassidy, Hetty Johns, and John Kiger. In 1982, Allen Ginsberg published a summary of the essential effects of the Beat Generation: spiritual liberation, sexual revolution or liberation, that is, gay liberation, somewhat catalyzing women's liberation, black liberation, Grey Panther activism, liberation of the world from censorship, demystification and or decriminalization of cannabis and other drugs, the evolution of rhythm and blues into rock and roll as a high art form, as evidenced by the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, and other popular musicians influenced in the later 50s and 60s by Beat Generation poets and writers' work. The spread of ecological consciousness, emphasized early by Gary Snyder and Michelle McClure, the notion of a fresh planet, opposition to the military industrial machine civilization, as emphasized in the writings of Burroughs, Huncke, Ginsberg, and Kerouac, attention to what Kerouac called a second religiousness developing within an advanced civilization, return to an appreciation of idiosyncrasy versus state regimentation, respect for land and indigenous peoples and creatures, as proclaimed by Kerouac in his slogan, "From on the road, the earth is an Indian theme." Theatre of the oppressed describes theatrical forms that the Brazilian theatre practitioner Augusto Boal first elaborated in the 1970s, initially in Brazil and later in Europe. Boal was influenced by the work of the educator and theorist Paulo Freire. Boal's techniques use theatre as means of promoting social and political change, in alignment originally with radical left politics and later with center left ideology. In the theatre of the oppressed, the audience becomes active, such that as spect actors, they explore, show, analyze, and transform the reality in which they are living. Boal points out that when we are simply passive audience members, we transfer our desire to take action onto the characters we identify with, and then find that desire satiated as the conflict resolves itself on stage, in films, or in the news. Catharsis substitutes for action. Boal, following breath, calls this bourgeois theatre, which functions to reproduce elite visions of the world and pacify spectators. He says bourgeois theatre is finished theatre. The bourgeoisie already know what the world is like and so simply present it on stage. In contrast to bourgeois theatre, the people do not yet know what their world will be like there. Automatically, theatre is therefore unfinished and can provide space to rehearse different possible outcomes. As Boal says, one knows how these experiments will begin, but not how they will end, because the spectator is freed from his chains, finally acts, and becomes a protagonist. Theatre of the oppressed encompasses many forms, including the following. Image theatre invites spectators to form a tableau of frozen poses to capture a moment in time, dramatizing an oppressive situation. Forum theatre is a short play or scene that dramatizes a situation with a terribly oppressive ending that spectators cannot be satisfied with. Legislative theatre takes forum theatre to the government and asks spectators to not only attempt interventions on stage, but to write down the successful interventions into suggestions for legislation and hand them into the elected officials in the room. Invisible theatre is a play that masquerades as reality performed in a public space. Newspaper theatre is a system of techniques devised to give the audience a way to transform daily news articles or any non dramatic pieces to theatrical scene. Theatre of the absurd, a term derived from the existentialism of Albert Camus and often applied to the modern sense of human purposelessness in a universe without meaning or value. Many 20th century writers of prose fiction have stressed the absurd nature of human existence. Notable instances are the novels and stories of Franz Kafka, in which the characters face alarmingly incomprehensible predicaments. The critic Martin Esslin coined the phrase theatre of the absurd in 1961 to refer to a number of dramatists of the 1950s, led by Samuel Beckett and Eugene Ionesco, whose works evoke the absurd by abandoning logical form, character, and dialogue together with realistic illusion. The classic work of absurdist theatre is Beckett's Waiting for Godot, published in 1952, which revives some of the conventions of clowning and farce to represent the impossibility of purposeful action and the paralysis of human aspiration. Other dramatists associated with the theatre of the absurd include Edward Albee, Jean Genet, Harold Pinter, and Václav Havel. ASHCAN School or ASHCAN School, an artistic movement in the United States during the early 20th century that is best known for works portraying scenes of daily life in New York, often in the city's poorer neighborhoods. The best known artists working in this style included Robert Henry, George Lukes, William Glackens, John Sloan, and Everett Sheen. Some of them met studying together under the renowned realist Thomas Anschutz at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Others met in the newspaper offices of Philadelphia, where they worked as illustrators. Teresa Bernstein, who studied at the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, was also a part of the Ashcan School. She was friends with many of its better known members, including Sloan, with whom she co founded the Society of Independent Artists. The movement, which took some inspiration from Walt Whitman's epic poem Leaves of Grass, has been seen and emblematic of the spirit of political rebellion of the period. The Ashcan School was not an organized movement. The artists who worked in this style did not issue manifestos or even see themselves as a unified group with identical intentions or career goals. Some were politically minded and others were apolitical. The unity consisted of a desire to tell certain truths about the city and modern life they felt had been ignored by the suffocating influence of the genteel tradition in the visual arts. Kitchen sink drama, a British cultural movement that developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s in theatre, art, novels, films, and television plays, whose protagonists usually could be described as angry young men who were disillusioned with modern society. It used a style of social realism which depicted the domestic situations of working class Britons living in cramped rented accommodation and spending their off hours drinking in grimy pubs to explore controversial social and political issues ranging from abortion to homelessness. The harsh, realistic style contrasted sharply with the escapism of the previous generation's so called well made plays. The films, plays, and novels employing this style are often set in poorer industrial areas in the north of England and use the accents and slang heard in those regions. The film It Always Rains on Sunday, appeared in 1947, is a precursor of the Rona, and the John Osborne play Look Back in Anger, published in 1956, is thought of as the first of the Rona. The gritty love triangle of Look Back in Anger, for example, takes place in a cramped one-room flat in the English Midlands. Sheila Delaney's 1958 play A Taste of Honey is about a teenage schoolgirl who has an affair with a black sailor, gets pregnant, and then moves in with a gay male acquaintance. It raises issues such as class, race, gender, and sexual orientation. The conventions of the Rona have continued into the 2000s, finding expression in such television shows as Coronation Street and East Enters. In art, kitchen sink school was a term used by critic David Sylvester to describe painters who depicted social realist type scenes of domestic life. Kitchen sink realism involves working class settings and accents, including accents from northern England. The films and plays often explore taboo subjects such as adultery, premarital sex, abortion, and crime. In the United Kingdom, the term kitchen sink derived from an expressionist painting by John Bradby, which contained an image of a kitchen sink. Kitchen sink realism was also used in the novels of Stan Barstow, John Brain, Alan Sillito, and others. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the video, please share and subscribe.